The sort of punk rock humor portion of tonight's festivities. And one thing I wanted to say really quick was, like Bill, I actually know a good friend of mine, musician / struggling actor friend of mine who was in Pecker too. And I always give him a lot of, I always tease him and give him shit about it and stuff and whatever on Facebook or whatever and stuff, just teasing him and saying yeah, man, you were great in that movie. Your part was where Christina Ricci threw you out of the laundromat that she was running because you were humping a washing machine. And he's just she's like, get out of here. And he left. And so I do know someone else that was in Pecker. And just to start, briefly, a little intro to this piece, which is called Government Issue, Creation of a Monster. More or less, I am working on a book right now, hoping to complete it by the end of this year. And when it's dark and dismal outside, that's when I do best. It's like punk rock, man. It's dark. It's dark. Like a David Lynch movie. I'm tossing around a few titles like All the Anarchy You Can Eat or Hear the Scream or something like that. And I wrote all these memoirs about from childhood and Government Issue. And Government Issue was a band that I helped form in 1980. And early on, there was another band that I was in called the Stabb, which is hence my nickname, my stage name, John Stabb and whatever, because I tried to go by John Schroeder, my real name, in one of our records. I called it John Stabb Schroeder on a record called Boycott Stabb, oddly enough. And all these people came up to me as punk rock kids and friends, and I was like, what the hell is up with that, Schroeder? What's your name is Stabb, what's the Schroeder thing? And I'm like, it's my real name. I was like, yeah, right, whatever. So they just thought I was messing with them again, because I'd always sort of try to confuse the punks as much as I could, as humanly possible. And so I formed this band called the Stabb with some friends of mine, a guy named Pete Murray, a guitarist, and he could play amazing. At least I thought he could play amazing. He could play amateur versions of Sex Pistols and Clash songs. So I thought, oh man, that guy is great. So we wanted to form a band, and a friend of mine who couldn't make it tonight, he was working for his job at a place called Counterintelligence, Richard Barnes. Is a place that measures out counters and stuff for houses and stuff and everything, and that's his gig right now. But he was a friend of mine in high school, and he helped me form the band, the Stabb, and so this is basically the whole story about that and Government Issue. During the summer of 1980, I was hanging out at a Wheaton, Maryland record store, Backstreet Records, where I befriended a high school kid named Andrew J. Allen. He and I both dug groups like the Sex Pistols and the Clash, but unlike Andrew, I wasn't into Springsteen or the Grateful Dead. Still not. On days when Mark couldn't make practices, this was a guy named Mark Alberstadt. He was a young, studious, nerdy Jewish kid that never dressed punk rock, but he played amazing. He was like the John Entwistle of drums. He was like the Who's bassist, but he could just make a simple kit sound totally amazing and effortlessly. Basically, he couldn't make practices, and Andrew came around to bang on the kit. Okay, he wasn't the best drummer, but he could more or less keep the beat. Since I was practically living at Backstreet that summer, purchasing cutout records and punk pins, Tom Beach and Jay Thomas, the owners, asked if I wanted to work for them. They paid in merchandise, so I was thrilled to clean records and watch over the little shop. Our bosses definitely weren't into actually paying us naive kids money, but Andrew and I were cool with that. I did have to put up with a lot of their good-natured jabs at my punk rock taste. The store's name was in direct tribute to Springsteen. Autograph icons of the boss assaulted me wherever I turned. Tom would always say, I know you like that punk stuff, but, Bruce was the original punk. I looked at my boss like he was trying to sell me snake oil. At the time, Tom always claimed to hang out with the Rolling Stones because he was a famous photographer, but I didn't know if I bought that either. It wasn't until many years later that I noticed Tom's name in the photo credits in his Stones photo book. Interesting. So all that talk of, I was hanging out with Keith when the Stones were in town, was really true. I guess so. It was at the record store that a woman donned in thick cake makeup and vicious eye pencil introduced herself to me as Monique Unique. She was a few years older than I was, into the New York Dolls, Bowie, and the Sex Pistols. I still can't stand the Dolls vocalist David Johansen's voice, but I like them musically. And Johnny Thunder's later band, the Heartbreakers, I love that shit. Surprised that anyone in suburban Maryland was even remotely into punk, Monique wanted to drag me along to one of her favorite nightclubs. When Scandals, a tiny Georgetown venue, offered the Untouchables and the Teen Idols one night, June 30th, we went to see them. They played this ultra-fast, thrashy music that really moved me. I was familiar with the mid-tempo pace of British punk, but this was something new. While the bands tore it up, their fans slammed bodily into one another at hyper speed. From that moment, I wanted to be part of this scene. The Untouchables frontman, a wiry baby-faced lad named Alec Mackay, who has actually been here before, and he did a really cool reading, I've heard, good friend of mine, especially riveted me. Watching this small guy writhing around and flailing himself into the fray gave me a real rush. He screamed his high-pitched, angry lyrics, and the kids went nuts. Like a little rat, he dived through people's legs and bounced up, only to fling himself wildly in another direction. After the set, the little punk rock rat looked utterly spent. It wasn't until many years later that I found out that Alec, like the infamous Iggy Pop, if some people might be familiar with that guy, I don't know. He does like Caribbean cruise commercials and stuff like that. And he just turned like 65 today. So go Iggy. It's his birthday. Yeah, go Iggy. Had asthma and occasionally smoked cigarettes on top of it. He must have been more drained than I thought. He was also the younger brother of Teen Idol's bassist Ian Mackay. That name is kind of known around the sort of independent music scene. He formed a label called Discord Records, and he's sort of like, he doesn't like to think of himself as like the icon or like the punk rock, like, figure of like the scene or whatever and all that, but he definitely created a lot. He's done a lot in his life, and he's a great guy. He's a good guy. And John will definitely, back me up on this, that our first EP, Legless Bull, which came out in 1980, we spent about approximately like 30 minutes recording it, and they might have probably produced it and mixed it in 30 minutes too, and we had to be responsible for, we had a great deal from Discord Records, this fledgling label that was just starting in 1980. They had already put out the Teen Idol single, which Ian was in that band, and they wanted to put out GI's single. So this EP that we had like 10 songs, and each song like was maybe like 60 seconds or a minute and a half, or just really short, fast, angry, crazy songs. And that's the EP that has those lyrics, the famous lyrics, "I don't want to go to camp" on, which I've had to live down that embarrassment many years, and I finally came to terms with it and went like, yeah, that's kind of charming, whatever, I guess. So John can definitely like back me up that it's, as John would say, it was the most profitable half hour I ever spent in my life. Because we get royalties for this thing. As shocking as it is, we have like iTunes Airplay and all kinds of stuff out there with this Legless Bull thing, and cuts that we did on a sampler called Flex Your Head. And so we were responsible for like $500 of doing the artwork and like folding the sleeves, and everybody glued and folded the sleeves. I had little record glue signing parties and everything, and it was crazy. Everybody would get together and drink really huge, big, like, big gulps, and eat bad 7-Eleven, like beef and cheese, bean burritos and stuff. This is before I was a vegetarian. Oh, that's horrible crap that you put in your system as your early days. But more or less, like, they put out the other 500, which that was for the recording costs, and it was a little studio called Inner Ear Records out in Arlington. Still exists. It's pretty amazing. But out of that whole scene, I basically get back to the whole story. I introduced myself to as many of these W.D.C. punks as I could, and I was pleased to find out that none of them had that oh-so-cool, snotty pretentiousness I had expected from real punk rockers. I mean, that was the picture the media painted of all British punk bands. These kids, by contrast, were a down-to-earth, friendly bunch. Ian, in particular, was into meeting new punks, and I told him about my band. Of course, we hadn't got out of the basement yet, but in my mind, we were on our way. Ian showed interest in my band, and he wrote my first name plus the band name in his address book, John Stabb. That was an important night for me. Meanwhile, the Stabb was expanding our musical repertoire. Mark brought with him an edgy 60s power pop garage sensibility, and we added his influences to our punk playlist. We interpreted No by the Rosillos and Why by the 60s obscure band called The Dirty Words. Pretty damn well, I must say. I wish I had tapes of some of those basement jams. I still maintain that Mark was one of the best drummers to come along in my musical lifetime, and anyone's musical lifetime for that matter. But we were still in flux once again. College interrupted our brilliant careers. John Berger announced his imminent return to school in Chi-Town. By Thanksgiving in 1980, I'd quit Backstreet in favor of seasonal stock work at W. Bell and Company. Now, this was like a place that, like, horrible, just crap. I worked upstairs, and I had to be the one guy that, like, either shot the whole tubes back downstairs with the, saying the order is going to come, or the tubes shooting back up, and you go, like, fill the orders and put it down the conveyor belt, and it was a horrible job. I mean, the worst thing about it was when I worked with John Berger there and everything, that this one manager we had, his breath smelled horrendous. I mean, that's an understatement. It was like Gorgon breath. Like the guy would like breathe on you or like talk to you and you're like, oh God, jeez. He smoked these like horrible cigars. So his breath just smelled like, it's worst dog shit you could probably stick your face in, which, I wouldn't know anything about that being a punk rock kid. So basically, like there, John and I shared tedious hours overseeing inventory from the warehouse, and we had plenty of time to strengthen our friendship. Aside from his pot smoking and fondness for whippets, nitrous oxide, I was going to miss him. Mark brought an old high school friend, Brian Gay, his actual name. We used to give him so much crap about that. And you're like, your name, Brian Gay. Gay, yeah. It's like, juvenile crap back in the 80s. Before we sort of learned to come to terms with, like, the whole thing. But, so at the same time, Brian was also playing guitar for a band called the Indians. The curly blonde-haired kid was a likable sort and had more enthusiasm than aptitude, so we had a new bassist. Back then, it was always more about punk spirit and sheer energy than professional musicianship. The school bug was contagious, and soon after, Kenny Alberstadt, this was Mark's brother, on guitar, succumbed to law school in New York. We were getting used to playing musical chairs. Andrew, my old friend from Backstreet, recommended his friend John Barry, who was still in high school. This was St. Anselm's all-boys Catholic high school in D.C. A little bit about that coming up. And you might know this guy, just, he's a good guy. He's actually okay. Don't let him like touch you or anything like that. It was a warm, muggy afternoon in November when the potential guitarist showed up to play with us. The tall fellow with black trench coat, large olive green Wellington boots, and spiky Keith Richards hair made quite an impression. We had no clue why he was outfitted in rain gear because it wasn't raining outside, but he looked like a rocker. Mark felt apprehensive. Years later, Mark admitted he thought Barry looked mean, like he was going to kick our geeky asses. But we soon determined that despite his rough appearance, John was a sweet and gentle dude, somewhat like Sean Penn's Jess Spicoli character in one of my favorite movies, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. We played a bit of our stuff for him, and the second he joined, he mesmerized us with his effortlessly blurry guitar action. He'd mastered a singular style, still powerful and hardcore like the Teen Idols and the Untouchables, but noisier and more chaotic. Man, how did you learn to play that way? Brian asked, and John answered shyly, I just take old Rolling Stone songs and speed them up. Pure genius. This cat knocked us out. John Barry was in. Some years later, I'd find out that John had already started his punk career before he joined the illustrious Stabb band. Missing in Action had featured the soon-to-be indie pop darling Lita Husick. According to her, they really lived up to their name. They played at John's all-boys Catholic high school, St. Anselm's Abbey School. Unlike GI, they didn't get banned from playing there, but that's another story. We actually started a riot on Valentine's Day, so I kind of refer to that chapter in my book as the St. Valentine's Day massacre gig. It was a lot of fun. John remembers it well. They opened up, Missing in Action, they opened up for a disco band. This was in 1980, and Lita banged on a primitive drum kit. When I talked to her recently, she had this to say about Missing in Action's first and only gig. We did a Clash cover and a Dead Boys cover, and we sucked. But the kids were mesmerized because it was all so new. The funny thing is, this local musician, Lita, would obviously eventually check out some early GI, or how else would she come to name one of her albums Joyride, which is what a record the Government Issue came out with in 1984. The day I came across that 1995 album, I thought sarcastically, hey, what an original title. But I hold no ill will towards her for copying a Government Issue title. I still dig some of her stuff, and at least she's a fellow Washington musician. So it's not as bad as the Bloody Human League and the wretched Dave Matthews Band blatantly lifting the title of their album called Crash, which was the last album that Government Issue came out with. The other guys in the band thought the Stabb name sounded too drab, and so I went in search of the perfect punk name. After checking out as many clubs as possible, I saw a new group, Black Market Baby, sometimes known as BMB, at a small Bethesda, Maryland club called the Psychedelic. BMB that night played under an assumed name as the Allied. Apparently their fans had a destructive nature, and BMB was banned from several area venues, getting banned in D.C. Cool, that's for me, brother. So I wrote a song, like on our first demo, that, John seems to think I wrote some pretty interesting things and stuff, but I was all about like attack the world. I was like angry. I came out of high school. I was picked on. I was beaten up. I was, the guy that bullied a lot and everything. So I had a lot of anger in me, and I had a lot of like frustration, and punk rock was like the hammer to the world's face that I wanted to hit them so hard and everything. I was just an angry young man, about 19 years old, and I just saw that like all these people were getting banned in clubs and stuff and all this, like these bands, and I thought, I'm gonna write a song about this. And basically it kind of went something like this. You tell us you don't like the way we dress. You say their appearance is a mess. Everybody's getting banned. You can go ahead and cuss because you can't get rid of us. Everybody's getting banned. No more music anymore. All the clubs just shut the door. New Wave's just a fucking name. You won't be places in your game. Tell us you don't like the way we dress. Say your appearance is a mess. Everybody's getting banned. Good? You see, that always came on the first demo that we did. I was a very young, naive, but angry young man. And I was really like thinking like, was that take good? But I didn't learn that you're supposed to wait like until years later, that you're supposed to wait at least about 3 seconds or something so the tape can go through, instead of like anything you say at the end of it is going to be stuck on that song. So this whole EP I put out that never came out until recently was the Government Issue 1980 demos. And I think it actually sounds a whole lot better than Legless Bull and whatever. But it's like after every song you'd hear like, how's that? Good? And they're like, dude, just stop. So I look at that as like kind of a little charming thing too as well. But like, anyways, so almost instantly, the Allied, their power and energy won me over. They weren't like the faster hardcore groups I'd seen recently. They were more like a mid-tempo British punk. Maryland's answer to Rockville, Maryland's answer actually, to The Damned. They even did a Damned cover, Born to Kill. Though I loved the intense anger of the thrash groups, it was BMB who offered up a playful sense of humor. These much older fellows proved themselves a force to be reckoned with. In front of the stage, I began to slam dance with a cool black punk rocker, which up to that time of me checking out some of the D.C. clubs was rare to a Maryland boy. I grew up in like suburban Maryland, which a good friend of mine came up with a song title called Suburban Wasteland, which really was. And Rockville is just like, if you ever hear that REM song, they got it right. Don't go back to Rockville. Terrible place. It's like concrete cancer. It's like you'll see like maybe a bush or some kind of growth in between like a median strip of like malls and cement, and it's just a horrible place. And I grew up there, and like my parents, got me in there and stuff, and I was able to escape Rockville. But I basically, my slamming partner told me his name was HR, and that he sang for another local band called the Bad Brains. At this point, I had no idea who he or his band were, just that the guy was a friendly punk who also dug BMB. Apart from meeting Ian Mackay, you could say that meeting HR was my second brush with punk rock greatness, though I didn't realize it. I was digging all the Black Market Baby songs, but one in particular truly rocked my bones. It was called World at War, and the chorus really knocked me out. The lyrics were, I want a war, I want to be a GI. I want a war, I want to live till I die. Or fight till I die. And that evening, I picked our brand new band name, GI. And on top of my world-changing punk rock experience, I also lost my virginity that night. Almost. No spoiler yet. I offered the name to my bandmates, and at first they approved. After a while, however, Mark thought that too many people would think that we were ripping off this other band called the Germs' debut album, titled GI, which stood for Germs Incognito, because they were getting banned everywhere in California. And God forbid we should borrow anything from a California punk band. The way we intended to use the initials stood for, I had assumed, government issue. So from this day on, government issue was born. Thanks.